Hello and welcome to today's webinar topic, The Truth About Sugar and Type 2 Diabetes. My name is Linda Ewer. I'm an accredited practicing dietitian and diabetes educator. Now, today's topic that we're discussing potentially could seem somewhat controversial, and this is making perfect sense because there's so many different opinions when you look, say, in the internet versus your next door neighbour versus your doctor. There's so many different conflicting opinions, so finding the right answers is sometimes very hard to do. Now, today, this webinar, we hope to kind of work through that and pull out the latest evidence available, which will hopefully make you more informed when you're making decisions about both your diet and your diabetes management. So for today's session, we're going to be discussing a number of things. So firstly, we're actually going to start by finding out what actually sugar is. So it's a word that's thrown around, and sometimes I think it's a bit confusing because people don't actually know what we're actually referring to when we say sugar. We're also going to look at how it's processed in the body. We're going to learn how type 2 diabetes develops. Then we're going to look further into recognising false claims and dodgy research, which is probably the hardest part, but hopefully by learning those underpinning things at the beginning, it will help you find those answers. And finally, understanding how sugar impacts your diabetes management in general. So let's start off by asking ourselves a question. So what have you heard about sugar and diabetes? Sort of like I said in the introduction, there is so many different things that are said. So on one hand, you've got things like you see on the screen here. So type 2 diabetes, isn't that because you ate too much sugar? You also might have seen books like Sweet Poison by David Gillespie or I Quit Sugar by Sarah Wilson. And there's even movies made about sugar to tell us how terrible it is for our health, and it's the evil of all things in our diet. Now, with this in mind, we need to obviously try and cut through that. So as I said before, we're going to get on board with trying to learn just some basics at the start. Okay, so defining what sugar is. So if we look here, we're seeing that sort of white, grainy, familiar substance, which we think of, well, it is sugar. But really, is that all we're talking about when we say sugar in our diet? So when you flip on the back of a food label and you see the word sugar, is that just what we're talking about? Okay, so when you're looking at this white table sugar, another word for it is sucrose, the other things that you might think of are things like cakes and biscuits. So altogether, these are called what we call in the diet as added sugars. Now, those aren't the only sugars that exist in our diet, and most of us are aware of this. So let's just keep going here as a bit of a revision. So other things you can think of would be fruits. So you might have heard of fructose is the type of sugar that is contained in fruit. There's also dairy products, which you might have heard of related to lactose. And milk as well. And then there's also naturally occurring sugar, so honey. So all of these all together, we like to combine into a category called natural sugars. And finally, then there's also things like bread and pasta and rice and different cereals, even beans actually. And these together we call starches. Now, the reason why they're included in this list is because the ultimate reality is that these all are foods that are carbohydrate foods. So all of these foods, when they are digested in the body, they will all break down to glucose, which is another word for sugar, but it's talking about the broken down form that forms in our blood once we're digesting it. So hopefully that clears it a little bit up here. So when we're talking today, we're not just talking about added sugars, we may be talking about all sorts of different parts of carbohydrate foods. So keep that in mind as we keep moving forward. So why is sugar actually in our diet in the first place? So there's a few reasons. So some is that it naturally occurs in food, since we saw on the previous slide, things like fruits and honey, etc. It can be used to flavour food. So we all know that when something is nice and sweet tasting, it improves the flavour, or it can give it a really interesting taste, which everyone in the world seems to be attracted to, and it drives us to do crazy things sometimes. So you'll even see back in the day that they were climbing up trees to get to that honey beehive to get the honey out. So it is something that as human beings, we really like the taste. Texture is another thing, especially when we're combining it with other things in food. It can give it a great texture. Browning, so it also creates this beautiful browning effect, which can give food, also it relates to the flavour as well. And finally as well, it can increase shelf product life. So you may see foods that you wouldn't naturally think contain sugar but are in there, things like sauces, etc. And that's because they're trying to keep and preserve that food for as long as possible. And I would like to say, actually, just back on that side, it doesn't necessarily make it right or wrong. These are just the reasons why they do, that sugar does exist in our diet currently. Now, to again set the scene, so I want to talk about quickly how does the body actually process sugar, and more broadly the word, we'll begin to use the word carbohydrates, because as we sort of went through in that first slide, when we talk about sugars, really we are just talking about carbohydrate foods. Okay, so we eat these particular types of foods. They get broken down in our stomach, and then they start moving in through our gastrointestinal system, and they get converted to glucose. So the glucose then, it moves into the bloodstream, and it's moving into the bloodstream to get where it's needed to be able to give us energy to make us move and keep us alive. Now, this glucose, in order for it to get from the bloodstream and move into the cells in our body where it's needed, it requires a hormone called insulin. Now, this hormone insulin is produced by our pancreas, which is an organ in our body that sits below the stomach. Now, this insulin acts as like a lock that comes in and unlocks the door for the cells and allows that glucose to move in. So we require it basically to make this transition, to move it from the bloodstream across. And in someone who doesn't have diabetes and their body is working fine, this happens in a seamless way. The body is able to sense it and produce insulin as this hormone. And as I mentioned there, it unlocks that door. So that's a little analogy that we use, and it powers us and gives us energy. Okay, so now let's start talking about what happens in type 2 diabetes. And this is really, really important because this will lead into the further parts and answering the question of the relationship between sugar and type 2 diabetes. So let's go back here. So we have these foods, these carbohydrate foods, or foods that sort of sugar foods, I suppose you want to say as well. These foods, again, they're broken down in the body and they move into the bloodstream. Now, when they move into the bloodstream, what happens is in type 2 diabetes, it's actually a bit of a two-step process that happens. Firstly, we have this pancreas that wants to produce the insulin. And what happens is that the lock on the door where these keys normally come in unlock, they become rusted. This rusting of the lock, another word for it is insulin resistance. So what it means is, as you can see there, we're still getting some energy to the cells in our body, but not as much as before. And what happens is over time, this can put the body under a lot of pressure, so particularly the pancreas, to having to work hard to produce more insulin keys to be able to unlock this door. Now, this goes on for potentially a very long period of time, and this is where it goes from pre-diabetes into type 2 diabetes when it's left unchecked. So the type 2 diabetes diagnosis sometimes is caught earlier on, but sometimes if people don't have signs and symptoms and don't get tested, they can actually be living with type 2 diabetes a little bit longer, and they've already got this decline in insulin that happens in the body. Because essentially what happens is when you put that pancreas under pressure over a very long period of time, it starts to wear out. So that's when people begin to have less insulin in their body and may need some help to get it to work better. Okay, so a key point alert here. So hopefully that little summary maybe draws us to this quite quickly. So type 2 diabetes is a condition that over time leads to our body not being able to break down carbs and sugars. So eating too much sugar and carbohydrates is not the main reason that it developed in the first place. So probably the question that is then on your mind is, so if it's not eating too much sugar and eating too many carbs, what is the reason? Now, the answer is it's actually very, very complex. And it's so complex, there's still things that we don't really understand in science. Now, this is a bit of a slide to show you the complexity that is involved here in this insulin resistance. So there's a number of things. So there's things like your family history. It could be unhealthy food choices, which we won't go into great detail there, and perhaps it's another topic for another time. But there is obviously foods that can be chosen which help make sure that that body is not being having the pancreas being put under lots of pressure. Other things exist are things like your ethnicity. It could be not exercising enough, so low levels of physical activity. Your age. So as you get older, you become more at risk of developing insulin resistance and in turn type 2 diabetes. That is something you can't change. Stress. So mental and both physical stress can actually almost, it can make this insulin resistance occur. It can even be to do with poor sleep as well. Medical history, so there is some conditions like polycystic ovarian syndrome or even medication use, so high doses of steroids or antipsychotics can increase this risk of developing insulin resistance. Having extra weight around your middle, that's called visceral fat, so it's the fat that exists between the organs in our body. Having extra visceral fat can put you at higher risk. I must stress here that when we're talking about weight, it's very easy to just say people that carry extra weight are at extra risk, but the more critical thing is to do with, it's more to do with that visceral fat. And sometimes people can be at a normal body weight and have high amounts of visceral fat. So something to keep in mind rather than just saying weight in general. Depression and anxiety also can be a risk factor for developing insulin resistance, and that almost goes both ways. So these conditions can cause sort of changes inside of our body, but also the changes, so the insulin resistance in itself can, and developing a chronic condition can also contribute to depression and anxiety. So it's a very big part that we need to be aware of when we're considering conditions like type 2 diabetes. Now, I wanted to just put here, I don't know if you've realized, but I've put them in two columns. So we've got here things that you can't change versus things that you may be able to change. I think it's important to stress here that the column is not things you can change, because a lot of people might be sitting here listening to this today and think, well, I've got a mental health condition and that's something, as much as I'd love to change, I can't. So these are what we call modifiable risk factors, but they're things that sometimes are very tricky to change for some people. All right, so let's keep that in mind. That is how complex it is. So when someone sits there and says, oh, you developed type 2 diabetes because you ate too much sugar, well, maybe, there's a small part that does relate to our diet, and that is undeniable. It's broader than sugar, but look at all the other things that surround that. Okay, so let's then sort of take another sort of summary slide from here. So in relation to managing type 2 diabetes, and when we're looking at our diet in particular, it's really good to think of it in two main ways. The first one is on a day-to-day basis. So on a day-to-day basis, we know from when we watched how the breakdown happens of sugar and carbohydrates going into our body, it does have a direct effect on our blood glucose levels. So 100% when we're living with diabetes, we need to be aware of what foods can then raise those blood glucose levels. Now, you'll see carbohydrates in general is the word that's used. So if we start focusing just on sugar, and probably when people say sugar, they may be more referring to refined sugar, but there is actually much broader, there's all those different types of carbohydrates that can raise blood glucose levels. So taking that emphasis off that sort of white sugar, refined sugar thing, there are other foods that can raise blood glucose levels too. Now, from a long-term perspective, so that was a day-to-day, what affects our blood glucose levels day-to-day, but from a long-term perspective, what are some things to be considering? And so insulin resistance, which we spoke about there, and we spoke about the complexity of it. So of the things that we can change in our diet, so I've listed here healthy, balanced diet, and I'll talk a little bit about it more in this next slide here. But essentially what you're wanting to do is unrust that rusty lock. You know, when we talked about at the start, that that when the body is trying to unlock those keys with the insulin, but there's that insulin resistance. So that's what we're trying to do here. So when we talk about insulin resistance and that healthy, balanced eating, like I said before, it's a very broad term, healthy, balanced eating. And again, it probably goes beyond the scope of this webinar today. And the reality is as well that healthy, balanced eating can mean different things to different people. In general, we are talking about a diet that's rich in whole grains, fruits, veggies, lean meats, dairy, foods that contain vitamins and minerals, antioxidants, etc. So these are the things that we know time and time again that science shows us that help make our body healthy. Fiber is another key nutrient of that as well. But you have to consider that it's got to take into account someone's individual requirements, their eating preferences, and lifestyle in general too. So big topic, but we won't get into it too much today. The other things is physical activity can also unrust that rusty lock. And I forgot to say, but that can of WD-40 is really the analogy of what can we do to unrust that rusty lock. And finally, medications is another one. So there are some very clever medications that have been made out there that will help improve the insulin resistance. Okay, so let's now go back into some myths. So debunking common myths about sugar. Okay, so the first myth that you may have heard, so you might have heard carbs and sugar make me put on weight. So I can't count the amount of times I've heard friends, family, and clients talk about this. Now, to start sort of explaining this, it's pretty important to set the record straight that when we're talking about macronutrients, we talk about these, their broad term name is macronutrients. We have carbs, fats, and protein. Now, each per gram contain a certain amount of energy. So when we have a surplus of energy and we are not exercising enough, that's what causes us to put on weight. And vice versa, if we begin eating less than what we require and we're exercising potentially more, that can cause us to lose weight too. That's very, very simplistic. There's a lot of other complex factors involved there, but just to keep that in mind. But as you can see here that both carbs and protein contain a similar amount of energy per gram, whereas fat contains about double that. So with that in mind, when we say, oh, I ate too much bread is what I needed to cut out of my diet. It's got too much sugar, too much carb, and it's causing me to put on weight. And we can think of that versus potentially a piece of cake. Now, really, what is the difference here? So there's a couple of things. So they do both contain carbs. There's no denying that. There's sugar and starches in both of these foods. The main difference is, though, that although bread does contain carbohydrates, which does break down to sugar, it also contains things like fiber, depending on the type of bread, obviously, but say a whole grain bread. So fiber, vitamins, minerals, and even prebiotics. So we know that those fibers are actually going to be feeding those healthy bacteria in our gut. So the bread, although can raise blood glucose levels, from a management of diabetes perspective, should you be cutting necessarily bread out of your diet completely? Well, maybe not. And if you are going to do any sort of lower carb sort of style eating, it may be that you just need to keep in mind that potentially this is something that can't be done long term because you're running the risk of issues with your gut, lacking of fiber, and also a decrease in vitamins and minerals. On the other side of that equation, which we see the cake, so yes, the cake is definitely a carbohydrate food, and it is containing those really refined sources of sugar. It also has a large amount of saturated fat. So if you're going to put these two items of food in the same category to say that you need to cut them out of your diet, well, maybe think again, because potentially it's actually the cake that there's something that might be, and I'm not saying, because food is enjoyment too, but cutting that piece of cake out might be a more beneficial thing than necessarily cutting out all bread. Yeah, so just have a little bit of a think about that. And also on that, I think it's important, and a lot of the time it's not properly explained, but foods are not just one macronutrient. So a item of food is not just a carb, it's not just a protein, and it's not just a fat. It can be, and it usually is, a combination of all three things. Perfect example here is a donut. So when we do the breakdown, we can see that 57% of that donut is carbohydrates, 35% of it is fat, and the remaining 9% is protein. So who would have thought there was protein in a donut, hey? When we then also keep in mind that per gram fat has double the amount of energy than the carb and the protein, when you actually work out where the energy is coming from, we soon realize that it's actually, when we look at a donut, it's more the saturated fat, or the fat, but the fact that it's saturated doesn't help cholesterol levels. But that is probably what is causing you to be putting on weight or not being able to lose weight in the first place. So just something else to keep in mind there. The second myth, so sugar from fruit should be avoided. So as you can see in the quote here, so isn't the fruit sugar fructose the worst type of sugar? Now, it has definitely received a lot of bad press over the last few years, and I mentioned that sugar film, and you'll read in David Gillespie's books as well. It'll talk about that, sugar, and particularly fructose, is this very dangerous type of sugar, because the way it breaks down and metabolizes in the body is different to other types of sugar that exist. Now, while this is true, and it does have more of an effect of storing as fat in our body and contributing to that visceral fat that can affect your health and increase your risk of insulin resistance, the really important key message here is that fruit is not just fructose. So really, a piece of fruit is actually a combination of both fructose and glucose as well, which a lot of people don't realize. So yes, it does impact blood glucose levels. The other important thing is that not all fruits are equal. So some fruits are actually quite low in carbohydrates, or if you want to use the word sugar or fructose or whatever, compared to other foods. So for example, berries contain very low amounts of carbohydrate versus say a ripe banana, which is going to contain quite a lot more. Interestingly as well, while I think of it, the ripeness of fruit also changes the amount of carbohydrate that's in that food. So if that banana is very ripe, it's going to have more sugar or carbohydrate, versus if it's a little slightly less ripe, so a little bit more green, but obviously you want it to be able to be nice to eat, but it will contain less carbohydrate if it's less ripe. What else should I say on this slide? Yeah, so when we talk about, or when you read the scientific papers that talk about fructose and its damaging effects on the body, when you look closely at those pieces of research, they're focusing on when they isolate fructose. So some of you may have heard of the high fructose corn syrup that exists. Now, luckily in Australia, our food regulation systems don't allow us to be using this in our foods, because it is pretty well, it is just the fructose part of that part of the sugar, which is damaging to health. So unfortunately in America, this is not as tightly regulated, so they do have a lot of high fructose corn syrup that exists in food and soft drinks, etc. So we don't have the same issue here, luckily. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else I'd like to say on this slide here. The overall important thing is, so the other thing that fruit does provide, and we talked a little bit about before when we were talking about bread, is the other things that exist in fruit. So here we're talking about, again, fiber, we're talking about the prebiotics for the gut health, vitamins, minerals, antioxidants. So when they've actually done research and studies into is fruit healthy for people living with type 2 diabetes, mostly it is actually protective. Obviously, you want to be aware that you don't want to be having lots of fruit, and the recommendation is usually no more than 2 serves a day. But I think it's being careful about choosing fruits that don't necessarily have huge impacts on your blood glucose levels, and maybe not combining it with other carbohydrate foods in the same meal to again increase that load of carbohydrate in the meal. Now, the third myth is going on a sugar-free diet is the best way to restore my energy levels and lose weight. Again, I would imagine a lot of you have heard things like this before. So there's a couple of things to talk about here. Now, firstly is generally when someone goes on what we call a sugar-free diet, it's usually very regimented, and usually it's cutting out and taking away all those, we like to use the word discretionary foods. So the things like the cakes, the biscuits, lollies, soft drinks, chocolate, etc. So when you take away those things from the diet, irrespective if you're taking away foods that just contain carbohydrates, you will see a change which could result in better energy levels and weight loss. And that's simply for the fact that someone is actually just cleaning up their diet. And that was a lot of, so back in the day when they talked about the paleo diet, everyone was saying how amazing they were feeling. Now, the reality was it was probably more that they were getting rid of all the junk foods, so the alcohol and all those other foods that I said before, and that was what was giving them these really good results. So from an energy perspective as well, so if you begin to remove foods that are increasing this likeliness of insulin resistance, you're also going to be, like WD-40, spraying that rusty lock to improve the amount of energy that you're getting. So in general, if someone is able to make some adjustments to their diet and increase the amount of fruits and veggies, whole grains, etc., that's going to be doing wonders for their body and for their diabetes, and allowing that glucose to be moving out of the bloodstream and into the cells where it's needed to give you power and energy. The other point I wanted to make as well, and this is in regards to weight loss, is that the other myth you hear or people perceive when they go on these either low carb or no sugar diets is that they all of a sudden lose a whole heap of weight very, very quickly. So it seems very exciting at the time. However, it's important to know that when we aren't using glucose in our body, it stores in both our liver and our muscles as glycogen. Now, this glycogen is holding on to these glucose molecules, but with it and to hold it, it requires water. So what happens is when you start losing these stores, which can happen over a very short period of time, so you stop eating these carb and sugar foods, the water will then move out of the system as well. And this can equate to kilos of weight lost instantly. So I think it's important that you keep that in mind, is that it may just be that quick change that happens, but the reality is if you eat carbohydrates again, the water will hold on to the glycogen to allow that to store again. And that's not good, that's not losing fat, that's just losing water. So it's actually probably from a hydration perspective, a little bit unhealthy for you as well. The other thing is as well, so over time, yes, you might feel great and wonderful in the first, couple of weeks, but it's keeping in mind what can happen when you start removing these core foods out of your diet. when I'm talking about this, I'm not talking about refined sugars. I 100% agree. Refined sugars, if we can try and remove those from the diet as much as we can, that is what we want. But when we're talking broadly about carbohydrates, this is where over a long period of time it can cause issues such as constipation, issues with your gut health, deficiencies, and even malnutrition in some respects, which can impact on even your immune system. So that's hopefully some more information there in regards to that myth. Okay, so my final key takeaway messages. So eating too much sugar alone does not cause type 2 diabetes. I hope that is now quite ingrained when you think of the slide of what, when we're talking about that, the cause of type 2 diabetes is that insulin resistance, but that cause is coming from so many different things in your life, things of which you can control and things also of which you can't control either. And like I said just a second ago, I absolutely am advocating for reducing added sugar in your diet. So if you can be making any kind of change, it's going to be just trying to remove out those junk sort of foods first before you do anything else. And you'll probably be pleasantly surprised by what you can see. So I think sometimes when we get in a bit of a diet mindset, it's easy just to go, all right, I'm going to cut everything out. But start small. Start off by just, if you're having 2 biscuits in the evening after dinner, reduce it down to 1. Start small, build it up, and you'll be amazed to see over time what that can do for your body and for your diabetes management as well. Removing all sources of sugar and carbs from your diet may not necessarily be a beneficial thing and can be harmful. Here, I'm probably referring more when I talk about carbs, and again, we're talking about foods that contain fiber, vitamins, minerals, etc. So I think I've made that point probably quite a few times. And finally, everyone's circumstances are completely unique. So just because something worked for someone else doesn't necessarily mean to say it's going to work for you. And I think it's really important when you start hearing people getting really, they're saying that this diet will work for you and you need to follow this to the letter, and this is going to be something that you need to invest in. I personally think that's false, and I'd also be wary of things that cost money. Yes, it's great to be able to, get a recipe book or get an app or get something to motivate you. But if you're investing a lot of money into something or into someone, it, I think, can sometimes raise some alarm bells, which you don't need to be doing. Okay, so just finally, just quickly talking about the NDSS, so that's the National Diabetes Services Scheme. There is so much information, support and services available. So things from, say, local education programs that we run and different events. I just wanted to plug a couple here that we run very regularly all across Australia. So Carb Smart and Shop Smart are probably 2 events that would be most linked to what we've been discussing today, but there is many more events that you can find. To find them, you can go onto our the NDSS website to search for these. There's also the NDSS National Helpline. So you can see that number there, 1800 637 700. Now it's open Monday to Friday, and essentially it's ringing up to be able to speak to different health professionals. So we have diabetes educators, dietitians, exercise physiologists, psychologists on board. I just think it's a free service that's available to anyone who's registered with the NDSS. And so keeping that in mind, that it's there in as a sort of thing you can pull out if you need, it's a really great service. Also the website. So the website contains fact sheets, resources, the webinars, even translated material for different language groups. And finally, the NDSS is also responsible for subsidised products under the NDSS. So things like blood glucose test strips, pen needles, syringes, pumps, consumables, and CGM. All right, so thank you so much for joining me today. I hope today has given you some ideas and has helped in trying to bust some of the myths that you come across. So if you have any further questions, I urge you to contact the NDSS helpline, as I mentioned before, and the number is on your screen. But in the meantime, good luck, and hopefully we'll see you at a program soon. Thank you.